Hello, my name is Brian Burke, and I've got something I kind of want to talk about. Recently, noted commentator Dennis Prager was in a panel with Jordan Peterson and other scholars to discuss the book of Exodus, the biblical book of Exodus. And he made some comments there that I do have a little bit of an issue with. He received a little bit of pushback for his comments, but I don't believe he received quite enough. It was at about the 1 hour mark of episode 2 of Jordan Peterson's Exodus series that he is doing right now. In it, Dennis Prager expresses difficulty with accepting that God would take all evil and turn it into good. At the time, they were discussing the opening section of Exodus where the Egyptians are going and killing all of the Hebrew babies, which I think is a pretty good starting point for his position. It certainly isn't obvious that it lends itself towards a different position. He also used as a defense for his argument the Holocaust, which I agree also is pretty hard to argue in the other direction. It definitely does defend his point on its own very well. However, I believe that from a Christian perspective, from an Old Testament writ large perspective, and then from a Torah specifically perspective, it is very difficult to hold that position for long. And I'm going to get into why. I do believe that God will take all evil and work it towards good. And I'm going to get into exactly how that is in just a moment. To begin with why, from a Christian perspective, this is a position that we must hold, I'm going to start by reading from Romans 8:28. In Romans 8:28, we see that, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." I mean, it doesn't take a whole lot to look through early Christian history to see that sometimes people had to deal with some pretty terrible things. While it is not likely that Christians were thrown to lions, Christians had all manner of other things happen, from being used as a light source at night. The Apostle Paul, who is believed to have written the book of Romans, was beheaded. 11 of the 12 apostles were executed. Only the Apostle John is believed to have died of natural causes. So we see that in Christian perspective, God does work all things towards good, even if it's not really all that obvious, because, once again, so many horrible things happened to the Christians who are writing this kind of thing. Dennis Prager has an issue with the concept of this verse and what it's trying to express when applied to this example of the Hebrew children being slaughtered by the Egyptians, and also to the Holocaust, which, I mean, yeah, that is reasonable insofar as it's hard to accept. It is not emotionally satisfying. I would agree with that. But I don't think that it makes it untrue that God was still working objectively evil things towards good. I think that is still the case, and I think we can build a strong enough case for that being true, even if it's not emotionally satisfying. Let's take a step back and look at the consequences of what happened after the Hebrew children were slaughtered by the Egyptians. We see pretty quickly that the slaughter of the Egyptian children was necessary for Moses to end up surviving that, for one. He was put in the basket and raised by Pharaoh's daughter. We also see that it was kind of necessary for him to survive in order for him to flee. And the situation had to be kind of terrible for the Israelites in order for Moses to leave and be justified in leaving. Already we see that part of what God has planned is required in the Hebrew children being killed, as terrible as it is. So, Moses flees. We know the story of the burning bush. He's told to go back. He goes back. 10 plagues. The Israelites leave. They are allowed to leave. The reason why they had to leave was so that they could receive the inheritance that God had promised to Abraham, to live in a land flowing with milk and honey, which is Canaan. That is a good thing, and that only happened because the Egyptians murdered the Hebrew babies. we see that God took what was a terrible thing, he used what was a terrible thing, and used it for good. I read from Romans, but what the Apostle Paul was actually doing there was mirroring a similar concept expressed in the book of Genesis, specifically Genesis 50:20. What is happening at this moment is uh, Jacob had just died, that being Israel. He had just died, and so all of Joseph's brothers were coming to him to try to get into his good graces. They were remembering that they had kind of sold him into slavery. So what Joseph said is, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." What we see from here is that Joseph was able to remove himself enough from his horrible situation in the past to be able to say, all right, good came from this, good that God intended. I can see that now, being far enough removed from the events of what happened. I don't think that Joseph would have fully understood this few decades earlier when he was in prison because of the lust of Potiphar's wife. It's kind of hard for me to say, all right, he was fully aware of this at all time. There certainly was a time where it seemed like it wasn't the case. But just because it seemed like it wasn't the case doesn't mean that it wasn't the case. God was always intending for that evil action and every evil action that followed to end up in a place where good would be done. In this particular case, it would be, oh, Joseph's brother sold him into slavery. All right, well, now he's kicked out of his slave master and put in prison because of a lie. Okay, now he's the second most powerful man in Egypt, and he saves the lives of his brothers. It's not exactly a straightforward thing how evil action turned into good, but objectively it did, and we see that. I would like to point out that Dennis Prager's commentary on the book of Genesis notably doesn't have anything specific about Genesis 50:20, and I think that's a glaring omission. I think it might be that he didn't quite grasp this because it's not emotionally satisfying whether it is true or not, and it seems to me to be true. Now, this concept of God taking all evil and turning it towards good, as I've established, is not particularly emotionally satisfying. One of the difficulties is that Prager says that if that is the case, why should we oppose evil? Well, why wouldn't we? It is good to oppose evil. Just because something evil will turn into good does not mean that you oppose evil. It might even be that you opposing the evil is the good that is to come of it. I find it difficult to believe that Prager hasn't already thought of these kind of things, but I kind of need to point it out because it is a good point. What is evil will turn to good in God's providence. The good might be your opposition to the evil. It's worth pointing out that God seems to have thought of this. I mean, omniscience kind of does that, doesn't it? But he ends up giving us this passage in Isaiah. Specifically, it's Isaiah 55:8, where we read, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways, declares the Lord." And then into 9, "As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." And we see with that this kind of idea that, well, God's ways are not our ways. God knows more than you. God knows more than me. God knows more than everyone. The sum totality of human knowledge and everything that humans ever will know and ever have known and ever could possibly know is still completely contained within the knowledge of God. God already knows all of that and more than any of us can possibly comprehend. His ability for planning for the future is greater than we can even fathom. And I think that's a very appropriate description there. It is unfathomable. It's not very emotionally satisfying to say something like, God's will does allow for evil to happen, but it is planned such that good will come of it. But whether it's emotionally satisfying or not is irrelevant because it seems to me to be true. I suppose my issue is that Prager hasn't taken enough steps back to at least attempt to look at it from a eternal perspective. He does concede in that discussion that the outcome of evil turning to good is true in an eternal sense, but maybe not in a temporal sense, which, I mean, I guess I might be okay with accepting from him. But still, even in the example of the Egyptians killing the Hebrew children, we do see a temporal good coming from that, however far in the future it might be. As he pointed out, though, you also have events like the Holocaust, where that is far less obvious, where the good comes from it when there was a great evil. I'm not going to pretend to be able to answer that question in that particular instance. I don't believe it is for me to know. I don't believe it is for me to judge what that is. But I don't think it's necessary for me to say that whenever I have this principle that elsewhere seems to be always true, that God takes evil and turns it into good somehow. I guess that's my thoughts on this issue. It's not my intention to say that I don't think that Dennis Prager is smart. I think he's fairly intelligent. It's not my intention to say that I don't think he's thought this through. I think he has. It's my intention to say that I don't think that the emotional satisfaction to be derived from this issue really exists at all. There is no emotionally satisfying answer in truth. Because if Dennis Prager is right, then we don't see this inherent push towards good that kind of underlies the biblical narrative. I hope to be able to foment a discussion with this particular topic, because I think it is definitely an interesting discussion to be had.